Hi, this is Bill Carter, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Clark Summit and the incoming 2024 moderator of Lackawanna Presbytery. And I'm here having a conversation with the author of this book, Principles of Presbyterian Polity. That's Carlos Wilton. This is actually the first edition of a book that's been updated, and all of you really need it. So, hey, Carl, tell us who you are and where you are right now.
Hello, Bill. Good to be with you. I am presently honorably retired. I think that's the term that happened when I retired, though it's not the term anymore. So I'm dishonorable. In the Presbytery of Baltimore, I had most of my ministry in New Jersey, where I was 27 years in Point Pleasant Beach, and then had pastorates in Bedminster, New Jersey, and within Lackawanna Presbytery, an interim pastorate in Hawley.
Right.
But during a good chunk of that time, I served as stated clerk of a presbytery. I was 10 years in then Monmouth Presbytery, and then I served in what began as the Presbytery of Newton, then became the Presbytery of Northwestern Highlands Presbytery of New Jersey, which is the northwestern part of the state, as acting stated clerk. And I do some consulting too. I've done some consulting with presbyteries about disciplinary cases and how those are managed and that sort of thing. So I continue to be available to led by experience and understanding of situations to presbyteries in need. I was very involved, though, and this is, I think, the reason for our conversation, in a very complex merger that happened in New Jersey that brought the number of presbyteries in the state down from 7 to 4. It was a complicated thing to make that happen all at once. It was facilitated by the fact that at a particular Kairos moment, only 2 of those presbyteries had installed presbytery leaders. So there was a lot of interim leadership going on anyway. And it had just become time to make that change. Presbyteries were feeling stressed for resources, financial as well as human. We were having trouble, nominating committees were having trouble filling out slates, and there were continued financial issues and budget cuts. And it was just simply a feature of the change that we all know the denomination has been going through, the change in membership, and that led to a necessity that became apparent to many of us in Presbyterian leadership that we really had to do some downsizing. And in that case, that meant merging presbyteries. We had presbytery lines in New Jersey that had been drawn in the 19th century based on where railroad lines were located, because the idea is you'd ride the train back and forth between the towns where your presbytery might be meeting. And that was completely outmoded and not really reflecting the geographical reality. So we went through this complex process of downsizing all at once. And now there are 4 presbyteries in New Jersey that I think are all doing much better. 3 out of the 4 took to it right away. There's one that has taken a bit longer to make all the connections internally take place, but I think it was definitely the right thing to do.
Okay. And you were behind some of that conversation from its outset, weren't you?
Yes, the Monmouth Presbytery, where I was stated clerk, sent an overture about 20 years before the merger happened, asking the synod to take a look at it, the situation of presbytery boundaries, which the synod ignored for about 10 years or more. Mm-hmm. And then we just kind of kept like the importunate widow banging on the door. And they eventually saw the wisdom of starting some conversations about this. And at that point, there was a real felt need in some of the other presbyteries as well to do something.
So are you saying that churches and presbyteries take an interminable amount of time to get its work done?
Well, it's waiting for the Kairos moment, I think.
Yeah. Well,
they do.
I go back to what a friend once said to some of us, that the church may be the light of the world, but we're often the tail light, not the headlight.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So when you were here in Lackawanna, you served as the interim pastor of the church in Hawley. You arrived just about the time that the pandemic hit, so it took you a while to get to meet some folks, both in the presbytery as well as the church. But I recall we had an early conversation that you felt strongly that Lackawanna needed to expand its boundaries and start talking with Lehigh. You're nodding as if you remember that.
Yes, I do very well. Just having come off the change in New Jersey and knowing the kind of benchmarks that we use to indicate the need for basically larger presbyteries. It just seemed like that situation really was very much true in Eastern Pennsylvania as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we
complicating the situation a little bit that makes it a little different is the fact, of course, New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the country. Mm-hmm. And so the geographical stretch of the new presbyteries is a lot smaller than a combined, of each of the new presbyteries is much smaller than a combined Lackawanna and Lehigh would be. That's simple geography.
Okay.
However, we all have this new reality in our life that grew up during the pandemic, which is called Zoom. And it's the media, of course, in which we're conversing right now. Mm-hmm. And that raises all kinds of possibilities for having meetings where you don't have to have exorbitant gas budgets or hours on the road to attend a meeting. There needs, of course, to be some face-to-face, but it can happen less frequently and then have a lot of the routine business conducted by Zoom.
Yeah. George Jetson as a Presbyterian.
Who would have thunk it?
Who would have thought it? Well, so this took 20 years in the most densely populated state. You're not saying that Presbyterians are dense, are you?
No, not at all.
But why did it take so long, do you think?
Never underestimate the power of institutional inertia. People are comfortable with the way things are in a lot of ways, and it's like that old proverb or example, I suppose you'd call it, of the frog in the kettle, which I'm told has no biological basis to it, but the lore goes that if you put a frog in a kettle of water on a stove and gradually turn up the heat, the frog will stay in there until it cooks. But if you put it in a pot of already heated water, the frog will jump out immediately. Mm-hmm. And so we grow used to changes over time, and what would have seemed like an extraordinary thing a long time before seems just normal.
Well, I think also the metaphor of when things are declining or getting smaller, or older, we could accommodate that and justify it. And so it kind of sounds like a character from a Monty Python movie. I'm not dead yet. In fact, I'm feeling better. And then we try to convince ourselves that we can just keep going on the way it was when it's nothing like it was.
Yes.
Did you have any surprises or serendipities as the process finally unfolded?
Well, after a lot of years of feeling like the voice crying in the wilderness on this, all of a sudden, it just seemed to be the right time. Mm-hmm. That people said, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We really ought to think about organizing ourselves a bit differently. And of course, it changed the whole web of relationships. In each of the new presbyteries, you have new churches coming in. In many cases, there was kind of a nucleus with one of them, and then a bunch of churches added on the fringe. But your merger, if you go ahead with that, is going to be a lot simpler because it's just a simple two presbytery merger. What it means, of course, is that people have been used to doing certain things, and certain committees may seem to have been their committee. That'll all change at once as new people come in to do some of that work.
Okay. Well, how about the flip side of that? Were there any landmines?
Yeah, I don't think there were. Like I said, there was one case of one of the presbyteries, which is the one that's now called Presbytery of the Coastlands, kind of central New Jersey, where there was a very strong structure within the former New Brunswick Presbytery. And while they spoke about the desire to work with others, it became difficult to make that change happen. And that's why I say that's one of the four presbyteries that's been slower to develop a common life. But I think they're getting over that now. Really no other big landmines. One little thing that we didn't anticipate that probably ought to be thought about is that, and this is a thing that stated clerks will especially understand, that when it comes to the rules of discipline, You have the Permanent Judicial Commission when they have to do their work, and certain things they have to do in certain disciplinary cases involve pulling somebody off what we sometimes call the back bench. You know, there's 6-year terms in the PJC, and so most presbyteries have a roster of former PJC members they can call upon to do either sit on a trial panel or sit on some special committees that decide on things like administrative leave and that kind of thing. And what happens when you have a merger, we were told by the Office of the General Assembly, kind of after the fact, is that you no longer have that back bench.
Okay.
That because it's a new presbytery, you can't consider PJC members from former presbyteries, can't call them into kind of out of the reserves and into service. So to put a bit of pressure on the PJC to all be there for things.
And so
there may be some way to manage that. Maybe in the constituting documents, you know, have an action that says that we adopt all these former PJC members as backbenchers for the purpose of this provision of the Book of Order.
So it does kind of wipe the slate clean then,
yes,
at least in that regard. Okay. We've begun to have some gatherings with clergy, and as you well know from your experience, some clergy participate and some we never hear from. But among those who have chosen to get involved, we've had some great conversations, some Bible studies, some worship, some opportunity to spend time with our good friend Terry Chapman in spiritual direction. And we're beginning to build relationships. We're planning to have some joint presbytery meetings. We've already had a couple.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be going pretty well. The last one was at Camp Johnsonburg, which is a neutral territory for each presbytery. It's still fairly accessible for those.
But out of bounds as far as the boundaries go, yes.
Right. And we're going to try to emphasize a lot of presbytery meetings in person as best we can.
Mm-hmm.
What we're running into is it's a far cry from Troy, Pennsylvania down to Reading. And it's going to be hard to continue to build that. But
yeah,
we're going to take a cue from our friends in Western states and perhaps look at some overnight accommodations or a larger meeting over a couple of days and make it worth people's time.
I recall there were some retreats that some of the presbyteries held as they were coming together. They'd have like a pastor's retreat overnight, someplace like Johnsonburg, and focus on relationship building rather than business.
Okay. Well, as a former stated clerk, as an author, and as a professor of polity in, I believe, 2, maybe 3 seminaries, what are some of the polity steps that need to go into place? What needs to happen in terms of the governance, and how do we dot every I and cross every T? What are some things you would suggest?
Well, it looks like you've done a very important initial step already in taking a kind of a straw poll of whether you want to go ahead with this among both presbyteries. And what I've heard you just say, if I'm correct, heard you correctly, is that it was generally affirmed by both Lehigh and Lackawanna. People seem to be on board. I don't know if you have encountered any individuals who are really objecting to it.
No, and if we did, we'd ask what they might have in mind.
Yeah.
And I think we would hear crickets.
Yeah. So getting that initial buy-in is important. In the Synod of the Northeast, we did it by having a document called the Invitation, and I've just shared a copy with you by email. That was not an absolute commitment to go forward, but it was kind of a thumbs up. And when we knew we were going somewhere, when all 7 presbyteries were able to adopt that. So I think you've already passed that point, which is good. And the next thing I think you ought to do at some point is settle on a legal counsel, because there are corporate matters of corporate law here as well. And Pennsylvania may differ from New Jersey in some of this stuff too. So I also sent you a copy of what was called the Ecclesiastical Plan, which is what the Synod's legal counsel came up with. And maybe a Synod legal counsel was a place to start with for that, for advice saying, what do you need to do in order to merge the corporations, or as the case may be, create a new corporation
Right.
out of what remains of the old.
Okay.
I think there was a period of time where there was some overlap, as I recall. I'm trying to think of the exact details. And of course, there are legal matters having to do with, just in case kind of things, in case there's any legal action against the presbytery, if there's a case of, sad to say, professional misconduct that involves a lawsuit against the individual as well as the presbyteries. To maintain that some of that stuff is in place, you need to keep track of insurance policies from both presbyteries and make sure that that record of those is filed somewhere in case there is an old a lawsuit that brings up an old liability insurance claim or something like that. That's the kind of thing that I think the legal counsel would advise you of anyway. And I'm not an attorney, so don't cite me on that one in particular. But it would be good to have a conversation with somebody who'd be kind of the legal counsel for the process. And maybe the synod's the way to go with that if there's a lawyer the synod works with, or if you just want to designate either or of the legal counsels for one of the two presbyteries to do that.
Okay.
That's possible too. And that ultimately had to be actually voted on formally by each of the presbyteries and signed by their stated clerks as action as showing that action had been taken. And that's what really made the change happen. There was a date that was picked as the incorporation date for the new corporation.
Okay.
And so that's where you need some legal help, I think, to talk about.
Okay. And when that day finally came, was there the sacrificial calf roasted over a fire and glad dancing and all of that?
No, it was very quiet receipt of letters by certified mail, I think is what it was. But
all right,
I think there was a big celebration at some point too. That celebratory coming together.
Well, one of our concerns is, and this goes back to what I said and what we know about how clergy can be. There are some who are particularly engaged, and there are not some who are not. And we think if that also reflects some of the churches, that the churches would call on the presbytery only if they needed something from a presbytery. But a lot of them are pretty much preoccupied with subsistence. And we're trying to find ways that we can actually assist and build one another up. And that's part of the challenge.
Well, challenge, but there's also opportunity in the fact that a larger entity will have more people who can be of assistance.
That's right.
The church is in trouble. If you need conflict mediation, you're more likely to find some people who have training in that. If you have a larger presbytery than if you're a smaller one, etc.
Good. Well, any concluding thoughts or encouragements you would have for us?
Well, just to generally encourage you to proceed on the path that you're on. I think it is very much the appropriate thing to do given changes in demographics. As I said, the Zoom technology makes it easier to get the meeting piece taken care of. And just remember that this is a matter of many, many relationships. And so anything that you can do to nurture relationships with soon-to-be colleagues is a very important thing to do. So I think you're right on the right track with encouraging face-to-face meetings for those you can entice to come, and make it as attractive as possible. If you're going to have an overnight retreat, bring in somebody as a keynoter who you think would be a real draw, apart from just simply the interaction time, which is really what it's all about. Yeah. And it may be like too, and as when there's a congregational merger, sometimes you get people who've been on the fringes who suddenly step forward and say, I'd like to be part of this new thing.
Okay.
So maybe you'll find some people get kind of reactivated in terms of presbytery involvement.
Thank you. Sounds promising to me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. This is Carl Wilton, who is retired now, honorably and very honorably down in Baltimore, former member of Lackawanna Presbytery, stated clerk, professor of polity, and well-known author. So thank you, Carl.
Thank you.